Black America is potentially the most dangerous group of humans alive today. Dangerous to who? Dangerous to the corporate empire, Illuminati, imperial scum, whatever you want to call them, white supremacists.
White supremacy is the problem. Jews just happen to be white.
How much of the problems in the black community are the blacks' own fault?
Well, white supremacy is the main problem in our community.
How much of the problems are your own fault?
Excuse me, if we resolve white supremacy, we will resolve the problems of unemployment, we will resolve the problems of bad housing. The Reagan administration probably represented the epitome of white supremacy by cutting into every domestic livable program that whites and blacks had, especially poor people, and they showed their relationship with these people by proving their insensitivity. Now, Mr. Cook,
and the reason they're dangerous is because they're quite easily united. It might seem not true because there's so much division within black people in America, but the only reason they're divided is because the corporate empire spends billions of dollars keeping them divided because they are potentially dangerous.
Mr. Coakley, you've attacked Jesse Jackson, you attacked the late Mayor Harold Washington, you called them colorless. What black leaders, political leaders in this country do you respect?
Well, I think politics has a way of accommodation. I don't think we have true political leaders in the sense of that you're going to find purity in politics. Politics is about accommodation and compromise. When our black leaders go into politics, as was discussed recently in Harper's Magazine, blacks have to prove to whites that they will protect their interests first. That's why politics is not the type of game that we're going to continue to invest all our time in, because it's proven that it doesn't work. Politics will not whip white supremacy, but clear, accurate, documented challenges to white supremacy, as well as action, grassroots action, taking against the forces of white supremacy.
What makes them dangerous? Well, 45 million people united in the U.S. would be very dangerous. What kind of things is dangerous? Well, you might think I'm talking about protesting or getting together and rallying and that kind of stuff. Well, no, that's not the kind of danger I'm talking about. 45 million people united could do some serious damage to the financial market. 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 Serious damage to the financial market.
So I'm dark skinned with an accent, and when you had an accent back then, Africans, well, it wasn't that many Africans in America at that time. It was mostly Jamaicans. So you had an accent, you automatically Jamaican.
Right.
Africans, well, it wasn't that many Africans in America at that time. It was mostly Jamaicans.
You have to be logical. If I know that in this hotel room they have food every day, and I'm knocked on the door every day to eat, and they open the door, let me see them throwing food around, but they're telling me there's no food in there every day. I'm standing outside trying to sing my way in. We are hungry, please let us in. We are hungry, please let us in. After about a week, that song is gonna change to we hungry, we need some food. After 2-3 weeks, it's like, give me all the food, racking out the door. After a year, then you just like, I'm picking the lock, coming through the door blasting. We asked 10 years ago. We was asking with the Panthers. We was asking with them, you know, the civil rights movement. We was asking, you know, now those people that were asking, they're all dead and in jail. So now what do you think we're gonna do?
What that was all about, the revolution will not be televised. That was about the fact that the first change that takes place is in your mind. You have to change your mind before you change the way you live and the way you move. So when we said that the revolution will not be televised, we were saying that, like, the thing that's going to change people is something that no one will ever be able to capture on film. It'll just be something that you see, and all of a sudden you realize, I'm on the wrong page, or I'm on the right page, but I'm on the wrong note. And I've got to get in sync with everyone else to understand what's happening in this country.
In today's society of America, millions of people of all complexions are still undergoing the effects of a variety of dominant social engineering experiments, which just so happens to play a prominent role among their everyday lives unknowingly. Not only that, there are in fact particular prominent groups of people that has set the mandatory rules and regulations that all American citizens must abide by. still to this very day. And when it specifically comes to the so-called African Americans, or rather the descendants of the copper-colored indigenous people who occupied all of the now American lands pre-colonial times, the experimental methodologies are deeply rooted, especially physically and mentally, by way of things such as industrialism, environmental racism, compulsory education, manipulative indoctrination, paper genocide, and eugenics. However, I would like for you to note that the freedom of having life is like a seed. It cannot grow on its own and become a plant unless the climate changes environmentally. Now, many of you can recall hearing the phrase, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." And I agree with it to a certain extent, because even though you may be doing great right now, you should always make room for improvements, or rather changes, because it's better to be prepared than repaired after the damage is already done. Which brings me to my very first point of this segment, and that is, why are people of color in America considered to be the biggest threat throughout American society? Now, this question alone would be continuously answered throughout this video and my other correlating documentaries, because of how much detailed information is critically important to note when answering this question. This threat can be traced all the way back to the late 1700s and very early 1800s, at a time when white African and European colonizationalists, or rather kidnappers, were afraid of the threat of being murdered by the so-called coloreds, or rather the indigenous people of North America, due to the multiple Indian raids, rebellions, documented and undocumented wars rapidly occurring during this time period. This is also the very same time period where these kidnappers demanded that the Negroes be removed from the lands of America and shipped away to newly established American colonized lands in Africa along the coast. Multiple religious societies campaigned for this idea to become a reality, especially the Catholics and the Quakers, just to name a few. But the ball began to roll once John Lynch wrote a letter to the president. According to records held by the National Archives, in a letter to then former President Thomas Jefferson, dated December 25th, 1810, John Lynch, who colonized lands he named after himself called Lynchburg, Virginia, made a descriptive proposition to Thomas Jefferson that called for the, quote, colonization of the nigger people on the coast of Africa, so that a settlement can be established for immigrating the freed people of color out of North America and into Africa somewhere along the coast. In my documentary called African American Slaves in West Africa, History Books Are Lying, Part 2, I shared much detailed, informative information in relation to what really happened in American history. I exposed that we were all led to believe that our ancestors were stolen from parts of West Africa and then shipped to the Americas, when in reality, that information was told to us all in reverse. Some of our ancestors were forcefully relocated from southern east lands of North America to lands west of the Mississippi River, and also along the coast of Africa, and especially South and West Africa. I highly recommend that you watch that video, for it is critically important for the sake of our real documented history. Now, another side of this threat would be allowing the people of color to think freely. Being as though English was not our ancestors' original language to begin with, the early European and African colonizationalists implemented manipulative methods to force their own traditions, language, and cultures, just to name a few, upon our ancestors mentally, which in turn rapidly obstructed our ancestors' well-being physically, systematically. This method was also purposely designed to decimate their literacy and critical thinking capabilities, along with quelling the thoughts of retaliation by fear-mongering, allowing for this social engineering format of eugenics to prevail from generation to generation, affecting only those who are forcefully under the spell of its digested forms of slavery, or rather oppression, under the mysterious provisions and racist ideologies of white supremacy.
First day. So I asked my students, okay, what happened during Reconstruction right after the Civil War? What went on there? And what happened to me was an aha reaction, or I might better call it an oh no reaction, because 16 out of my 17 students said to me, that's the time when, right after the Civil War, Reconstruction, blacks took over the government of the southern states, but they were too soon out of slavery, and so they screwed up, and white folks had to take control again.
Birth of a Nation, the 1903 movie, as I recall,
Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, all rolled into one. Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, all rolled into one. And of course, these are all African-American students. I thought, my gosh, what must it do to you to believe that the one time your group was center stage in American history, they screwed up? Now, it'd be a different matter if this happened, but it didn't happen. This is, in fact, what we in sociology call BS history, that is bad sociology. BS history, that is bad sociology. They started the public school systems for both races. There were scattered schools for white folks, but no system that included the whole state. And of course, there were no schools at all for black folks. It was illegal, a felony, to teach even free blacks to read and write. So they didn't screw up. So anyway, I went to nearby schools. I watched, this was just before massive school desegregation, so I watched black teachers teaching all black classes this white supremacist history that was complete BS, because they were just teaching what was in the book.
In my documentary called The Duplicity of the Public School System, I shared much detailed informative information about the pseudoscientific methods utilized by way of college professors, anthropologists, sociologists, and many other correlating co-conspirators in order to teach all people of color, along with non-elite white people, about white supremacy-filled U.S. history, world history, and so-called African American studies and history, even though there were in fact very few of these scholars that were adamantly opposed to such teachings.
And what, may I ask, is an Aryan? I don't know myself. But let us see what our present so-called authorities have to say about him. They say he is tall, slender, blue-eyed, and blonde. There is no Aryan race. And more important, there is no master race. There are people who may find these ideas convenient, but science cannot support them. There is no scientific proof that there's any correlation between a man's racial characteristics and his native ability or character. In all racial groups, we find the same range of potentialities. We find idiots and geniuses. We find criminals and philanthropists. We must judge each man as an individual and not by the color of his skin or his eyes or by the length of his nose. Come in, gentlemen. It's comfortable. And remember that there is no master race. That is a scientific truth. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying.
Even during the times when the existence of federal laws prevented people of color to learn anything dealing with these foreigners' ambitions, agendas, and even their own propaganda, one must not forget about the year of 1776, when a new sheriff pinned his shiny badge to his chest and a code of conduct was created and implemented into the so-called laws of the lands. I'll be sharing more details about that in a later planned documentary. Now, the next part of this threat is also very noteworthy and critically important to the descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of this land, Turtle Island, now known as the Americas. Many of you can recall the American Holocaust of 1921, when the U.S. and federal government ordered the bombing of so-called Negro residents and businesses in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, murdering thousands of people of color and destroying hundreds of their own very prosperous businesses by way of U.S. Army planes, literally dropping bomb after bomb throughout the Greenwood district by way of an executive order called martial law, in which this specific order was created by Congress and President Woodrow Wilson of the Democratic Party before leaving office in March of 1921, and then immediately approved and implemented into law by then President Warren Harding of the Republican Party in May of 1921, just a few days prior to inflicting a deadly Holocaust upon its own American citizens. Now, I originally named my documentary about this The American Holocaust of 1921, and after the documentary accumulated 60,000 views in 4 hours, YouTube removed the video. However, after nearly a month of back and forth, it was placed back on my channel, and it is now called The History of the Negro Wall Street, the unforgettable horrific event of 1921. That is a documentary that I highly recommend for all people to watch. Now, I said all of that to say this. There is a reason why the famous influential activist named Frederick Douglass was able to contribute, quote, tens of thousands of dollars of his own money in order to save the abolishment of all 37 branches of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Banks that were created by law through then President Abraham Lincoln on March 3rd, 1865. And before I state that reason, I want you to note the timeline here. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, in which history states that the war occurred allegedly due to disagreements between politicians of the North, or rather the Union, and the politicians of the South, or rather the Confederate States, over the abolishment of slavery. However, the truth is that the Civil War was actually about integrating the free enterprise system with more of the indigenous aboriginals of the American lands, being as though many of our ancestors during this time period were not slaves, but rather indentured servants who were literally sharecroppers that owned farms, banks, and other institutions of business, which in turn allowed both heads of the same snake to acknowledge the fact that our ancestors were rising up as capitalists within this industrialized society. In other words, the Union recognized that the so-called Negroes in the North and the South were rapidly prospering tremendously economically, and they wanted to go into business with them to further their expertise in the free enterprise system. But most politicians of the South disagreed with this notion, being as though it single-handedly threatened the longevity of their not-so-prosperous small to medium-sized businesses. So the Civil War began in April 1861 and completed in May of 1865. Before the Civil War ended, some very important key factors occurred within this timeline. For example, see, that manipulative lie was told to you as a fear-mongering tactic in order to depict that one race of people are somehow superior to others. When King stated that through an act of Congress, the government was giving away millions of acres of land, he was referring to the Homestead Act of 1862, in which just a little over 30 years prior to this law, our ancestors' cultures, heritage, history, identities, resources, and lands were stripped away and became possessions of the federal government. in order to be distributed to the quote free whites that immigrated to America from Africa and Europe during the early 1800s.
Which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. Which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor.
The Homestead Act of 1862 granted these white peasants, as King describes, our lands that were stripped from our indigenous ancestors and all of the specialized benefits the federal government promised our ancestors by peace treaties that they would receive for being 90% of the help they needed in order for the United States to win all 61 documented wars that occurred during the 1800s alone. Side note, the Emancipation Proclamation abolished all forms of slavery the very next year in 1863. The so-called free Negroes and the so-called freed Negroes, along with the so-called freedmen, were royally upset and disgusted with the federal government. So they continued the multiple rebellions until they saw a change. The Homestead Act of 1866 was established by the government that allowed the Negro 40 acres and a mule. But the catch was that the Negro had to buy the land, and the price of the lands were lowered just enough so that the Negro could not afford it still. This is what King meant by America refused to give the Negro any land. These Homestead Acts gave these foreigners government-funded assistance, where the government hired our ancestors to teach these foreigners how to farm.
Not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm, with government money to teach them how to farm.
Because keep in mind, a true foreigner or immigrant wouldn't know how to grow anything in a mass area of land that they are not accustomed with or never inhabited before in their life. This is why King stated our farms.
They provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms,
Okay, so now, this timeline that I'm referring to begins with the Civil War in April 1861. Then, the first official Homestead Act of 1862. Then, the very next year, the Emancipation Proclamation Bill was implemented into law in 1863, in which that bill alone had absolutely nothing to do with freeing slaves from chains and shackles, like how history so loves to claim. No. In fact, the word emancipate derives from the Latin word emancipatus, which is the process of being set free from legal, social, or political restrictions, which has nothing to do with enslavement. In fact, the Latin word for civil is civilis, which means to affect fellow citizens in a legal or political sense. In other words, the stories of slavery in the Americas did not happen the way we were originally taught by authors of American history and world history. Because once an individual literally researches their family's genealogical background by records, instead of taking the word from some self-proclaimed scholars within their own communities with absolutely no publicly verifiable evidence to manifest, they will be met with the truth that these so-called slaves in America were actually prisoners of war who were contracted as indigent servants by way of industrialism, which also means that your ancestors were sharecroppers, being as though they were the original landowners who were contracted by the tenants, or rather the white colonizationalists who immigrated to North America from Africa and Europe, in which these tenants were allowed to use the sharecroppers' land by contract or treaty in return for a share of the crops produced on the sharecroppers' very own land. But this deal went bad, obviously due to a particular group of people that had a totally different hidden agenda in mind. The next part of this timeline would be President Abraham Lincoln crafting the 40 acres and a mule Field Action 15 in Savannah, Georgia, for the so-called Negro sharecroppers during the months of January and February in the year of 1865, which should immediately indicate to you that the Lincoln administration was willing to work out multiple other economic deals with the complaining indigenous people of North America who were rebelling and raiding multiple territories at this time due to being betrayed and undervalued by both the local and federal governments. So the very next month, in March of 1865, Lincoln was sure to create federal banks for the so-called freedmen that fought on both sides of the American Civil War, along with their descendants. These banks are known as the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Banks, or the Freedmen's Banks for short, in which over 72,000 accounts were opened, which led these banks to raise a staggering $52 million at that time, which is equivalent to over $100 billion right now, making it the largest grossing bank in American history at that time. Then, the very next month came, and President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 15, 1865, which forced Frederick Douglass to take over the Freedmen's Banks, using tens of thousands of his own sharecropping money, which was a lot of money at that time due to him being a businessman of color, just like millions of our ancestors were. Then, in the year of 1875, after much demand economically, along with well-respected hard work continued to manifest by way of the indigenous aboriginals of this land, Congress passed the first ever Civil Rights Bill in American history, allowing for the white immigrants to go into business with the indigenous businessmen and women of America. Our ancestors were prospering so well that a surge of newly established businesses and banks were rapidly changing the economy on a daily basis. And it also outnumbered the amount of banks owned and operated by whites. This time was uncommonly known as the beginning stages of the Civil Rights Movement, to a point where businesses owned by people of color went from about 3,000 to nearly 60,000 businesses, and the people of color that owned banks went from about 35 banks to nearly 150 banks nationwide, from the years of 1875 all the way until the year of 1934, according to the FDIC and the Federal Reserve. Now, so many important events occurred in the year of 1934 alone that I will have to save it for part 2 of this segment. However, I would like for you to note that people would love to claim that the place called Africa has the most resources ever in history. But if that is the actual truth, then why do you consistently see real Africans immigrating to North America to work at a job or to open up their own business and collect resources from here in America, then publicly inform their friends, colleagues, and co-workers that they are doing this all in order to send it all back to their families who are residing in Africa, literally? See, the answer to that question is very simple, because in today's society, the one set group of people who unknowingly accumulates all of the wealth upon this nation that keeps this country running in the first place, but would immediately spread its wealth to everyone under the sun other than themselves, which in turn attracts national and international businesses to their pockets alone, are in fact the so-called African Americans of this country today, which in turn leads you to now know the truth about why multiple economic records would state every single year that so-called African Americans would make up around 1% of America's wealth overall, purposely telling you the story in reverse in order to hide the truth, making that the real reason why African Americans, or rather the indigenous aboriginals of Turtle Island, are the biggest threat to America's society. but they just don't know it yet.
If you had 45 million united people that got together and decided they're going to create an alliance and they're going to decide on a daily basis how they spend their money, that would be dangerous.
Anytime you have to rely upon your enemy, you're in bad shape. Anytime you have to rely upon your enemy, you're in bad shape. Anytime you have to rely upon your enemy, anytime you upon your enemy, you're in bad shape.
The thing that threatens the corporate empire, Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, the thing that really threatens them is a group that could control their bank accounts. It's really simple. Black America needs to unite for one reason: to control how black money is spent. That's it. It's a game changer. It means that you control the scum that is oppressing you. They will not be able to handle that. I know it's a really hard thing to organise, but you can do it because Black America is a united people, really. They're a natural race that identifies with each other and supports each other, really. I mean, the divisions are just corporate empire scum investing money into keeping you guys divided, so I'd forget about it. Don't even think that you can't do it, because you can. And it's that simple. Control how black money is spent and you win the game. 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 Win the game.
In today's society of America, millions of people would settle for the stories of wars and slavery and other Americanized history based solely on the belief of what was told to them by word of mouth, or throughout the industrialized compulsory public educational system, which strengthens the ideologies, theories, and derogative blatant lies that they unknowingly became accustomed to over the years. And furthermore, today, they would deem this information as a fact. This is exactly where the problem lies for all people residing in America today, and especially for those who are the direct descendants of the indigenous Niji of these lands pre-colonial times, due solely to what our people would call our history nowadays, in which it purposely eradicates our real truthful cultures, legacy, heritage, spirituality, and even our actual history. Multiple methodologies were utilized to upkeep these various forms of indoctrination and propaganda for many years. And even though these social engineering experiments derived from a particular group of pale faces, they also received a massive amount of help over the years from other prominent groups of people, in which the majority of these people just so happens to share the same hue of complexion as you and I. I'll begin this segment just after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in April of 1865. And the American Civil War ending just a little over a month soon after that, which allowed for the vice president to Abraham Lincoln, named Andrew Johnson of the Democrat Party, to take over as president of the United States by default from April 15, 1865 to March 4, 1869. Now, this was post-Civil War times, so obviously there was a Reconstruction period, and especially for the southern states, being as though the majority of the South survived economically by the trade and sale of crops grown on farming lands by none other than our ancestors. Now, Just a month before Lincoln's assassination, he and the majority Republican-filled Congress established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands Bill on March 3, 1865, which was a bill set and designed to assist the so-called freedmen, or rather POWs, who were fraudulently contracted as sharecroppers in the North and the South, along with aiding poor white immigrants mainly of the South, who were tenants of the sharecroppers' lands before and during the aftermath of the Civil War. But this bill became only a temporary measure that lasted no longer than a year, due to conflicting issues with the all-white Democratic leaders of the South. And by the way, this was one of the few reasons why Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Now, out of nowhere, the Democrats believed that the bill did not provide enough support for the whites of the South, and they believed that it heavily favored the so-called freedmen in larger measures. This is why the Democrats called the bill the Freedmen's Bureau instead. And immediately following their outcries, all of the Southern state legislators passed racially charged laws, or rather codes, that restricted the Negro Indians' freedom from labor or servitude. These laws were known as the Black Codes of 1865, which also limited the so-called freedmen's resources and abilities to become prosperous economically independently. Voting was prohibited, bearing arms was banned, gathering and forming in groups for whatever reason was stripped away, and learning how to read and write was a criminal offense. During this time period, multiple cases of harassment and hate crimes began to rise rapidly all across the South, to the point where white state law authorities would racially profile and randomly arrest thousands of people of color for minor to major offenses that they never committed, and then immediately convict them to false imprisonment, or rather involuntary labor, in order to recycle slavery all over again. Then, when this bill was up for renewal in the year of 1866, President Andrew Johnson vetoed the bill because, according to the National Park Service, Johnson believed that the bill, quote, encroached on state rights and relied inappropriately on the military during peacetime, and that would prevent freed laborers from becoming independent by offering too much assistance, end quote. So now you know whose opinion Johnson voiced. Between the years of 1869 and 1870, the Bureau became the last of a dying breed due to the rise of violence occurring in the South that stemmed directly from a particular group of racially charged people called the KKK, which in turn led Congress to abandon the program indefinitely. Now, in part one of this segment, I mentioned that the Civil War was not about Southern whites wanting to keep slavery afloat, nor Northern whites wanting to abolish it. No, the truth is that the Civil War was about integrating the free enterprise system with more of the Negro Indians of the American lands, meaning as though many of our ancestors during this time period were not slaves, but rather indentured servants who were literally sharecroppers that owned farms, banks, and other institutions of business, which in turn allowed both heads of the same snake to acknowledge the fact that our ancestors were rising up as capitalists within this industrialized society. So in other words, the Union did recognize that the so-called Negro Indians in the North and the South were rapidly prospering tremendously economically, and wanted to go into business with them to further their expertise in the free enterprise system. But most politicians of the South, who were 100% white, disagreed with this notion, being as though it single-handedly threatened the longevity of their not-so-prosperous small to medium-sized businesses, etc. What is also important to note here is that during this time period, multiple newly incoming white foreigners from Africa and Europe were immigrating to North America, and the United States government continued to provide assistance to those immigrants, particularly with the Homestead Acts of 1862, 1866, and 1909, along with many other legislations that I shared detailed information about within my previous documentaries. And also what came about next was a bill that allowed for all of these foreigners to become legalized United States citizens under the color of law. This bill was called the Act of April 9th, 1866, or rather unofficially known as the Civil Rights Act Bill of 1866, which millions of people never heard of this bill before, for a particular reason. And by the way, authors of history would love to claim that this bill granted citizenship to the Negro Indians of North America, when in reality, this carefully written 10-section bill does not literally state that at all. For example, in Section 1 of this bill, it states, quote, "All persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, and such citizens of every race and color, without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States, to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, and give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property, as is enjoyed by white citizens, and shall be subject to like punishment, pains, and penalties, and to none other any law, statute, regulation, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding." In other words, this bill was designed specifically for the civil rights of the descendants of white immigrants already residing in North America since the late 1790s, and also for the newly incoming white foreigners immigrating from Africa and Europe to North America during this time period, allowing them to be granted federally recognized citizenship, state rights, and all other rights and benefits being currently, quote, enjoyed by white citizens by way of the United States government. Also, some of you may recall some of the verbiage utilized within this bill. That's because this Civil Rights Act Bill of 1866 was later adopted nearly word for word by Congress as the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, just 2 years and 2 months later, on July 9th, 1868. Now, I have shared much more information concerning the 13th and 14th Amendments in my previous documentaries called The Term Black Has No Standing in Law, Part 1 and Part 2. I highly recommend that you watch both documentaries, for they are equally critically relevant for the sake of what really happened in American history. Now, the so-called Negro Indians were allegedly becoming a massive threat to American society soon after Abraham Lincoln abolished the sketchy written or oral contracts placed upon our indigenous ancestors with the help of the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. But what history fails to mention is how our ancestors were rapidly becoming prosperous businessmen and women throughout the North and the South, and that President Andrew Johnson of the Democrat Party, an uneducated, racist, bigoted descendant of immigrant parents from Newcastle, England, in which his parents immigrated to North America during the late 1790s, attempted a variety of tactics in order to shut down the operations of the booming businesses and progressing wealth of the so-called Negro Indians. For example, Johnson became an advocate for the stronghold of the Black Codes. He successfully vetoed and dismantled the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands Bill, and he also weakened the establishment of the Freedmen's Trust and Savings Banks that I mentioned in Part 1, due to him cutting the funding and forcing Frederick Douglass to use his own sharecropping money in an attempt to save all 37 branches from crumbling, in which they eventually failed later on. And Johnson also attempted to veto the Act of April 9, 1866 bill, or rather the Civil Rights Act Bill of 1866, due largely in part to pressure he received from his fellow Democrats and his own personal belief that the bill would inadvertently grant citizenship rights to the so-called Negro Indians, being as though he and other Democrats were in full favor of the ruling of the Dred Scott decision back in 1857 and the so-called slave laws of the early 1800s. Now, despite all of what I just mentioned, along with the multiple lynchings and racially motivated harassment from white officers, white politicians, white senators, and white state governors, and even not being legalized citizens of the United States, our indigenous ancestors still managed to prevail within this industrialized capitalist society. Between the years of 1868 and 1869, with the help of some Republicans in the Senate and in Congress, along with newly incoming President Ulysses Grant of the Republican Party, the dialogue began surrounding the idea of allowing the franchise of the so-called Negroes the rights to vote, in hopes that they would vote the Republican ticket in order to raise the party's credibility, federal funding support, political, social, and economic power, and their very own future of existence. So after various Congress hearings and back and forth debates between the Democrats and Republicans of Congress, a compromise amendment was established that banned the franchise restrictions on the basis of color, race, or previous servitude. And after surviving tremendously difficult ratification fights, the 15th Amendment was established and implemented as part of the Constitution on March 30th, 1870. Then soon after that, you began seeing multiple people of color arise as political legislators. For example, there were 30 legislators of color elected in the state of Florida, then 41 in Georgia, then 42 in Texas, 112 in Mississippi, then 127 in Louisiana, then 190 in South Carolina, and the list just continued to go on and on. Our indigenous ancestors were rapidly changing the American society systematically, opening even more businesses and banks which outnumbered the amount of banks owned and operated by whites alone. And they were also gaining political standing and political power all across the South and the North as members of the Republican Party. This time was uncommonly known as the beginning stages of the Civil Rights Movement. Simultaneously, there were white Democrats who hated this change of their environment. Jealousy is the word that comes to mind when describing where their hatred stemmed from. And this jealousy became their uniform excuse to claim that their lives were allegedly threatened. So they retaliated in more ways than one. For example,
in New Orleans, in the Republican convention in Louisiana, the Klan joined with the New Orleans police, joined with the New Orleans mayor, Democrats. They attacked physically at the convention in New Orleans, Republican convention. They killed 40 blacks, killed 20 whites, they wounded 150 others. In 1868, they put out a push card in South Carolina, and it listed what they called the radical members of the South Carolina legislature. That push card's about the size of a baseball card. It was put up by the Klan. Klan put it out. It had the pictures of 63 legislators that needed to be wiped out in South Carolina. 50 of those legislators were black, 13 were white. Now, they were all 63 Republican. On the back of the card, it gave you the name of each legislator so you'd know who you're trying to kill. 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 So you'd know who you're trying to kill.
According to congressional sources and a 13-volume set of congressional hearing records held by the National Archives, on a chilly evening of Christmas Eve, the Ku Klux Klan was established on December 24th, 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee, and the Night Riders on New Year's Day in 1866 by none other than the Democrat Party. as consistently admitted in detail to Congress on multiple occasions.
Tell our sisters, our wives, our mothers, our grandmothers, sweetheart, this time, please stay at home. Mother, you have always stood for us, and we've never stood up for our families. But we're coming of age now, Mom. And we want to go to Washington and state our case. Our fathers, sweat, blood, and tears built this country. Our fathers and our mothers worked from can't see morning to can't see night to build the economy of the South, to fuel the economy and the industrial revolution of the North. We fought in all America's wars for a freedom that we have never achieved. We fought in the Revolutionary War that made America independent of England. But we don't have any independence ourselves. We are dependent on white people to do for us what we have earned the right to do for ourselves. We had congressmen and senators, and we had government representation. But the Night Riders and the KKK took it all away from us. Said, we don't want no niggers in the Congress. We don't want no niggers in high political office. So they killed us. They hung us. They burned us. Damn it! We died to build America. And America has rebuilt Germany and Japan. And the nigger is still suffering and dying in the streets of America.